Welcome to Pax Britannica. The Stuarts, the Scottish Restoration and Devil Land with Professor Clare Jackson. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Today I'm joined by Clare Jackson, Professor of Early Modern History at the University of Cambridge. She's the author of multiple books, including Restoration Scotland, 1660 to 1690, Charles II, the Star King, and Devil Land, England under Siege, 1588 to 1688. Her most recent book came out in summer 2025, The Mirror of Great Britain, A Life of James VI and First. Professor Clare Jackson, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
To begin with, I wanted to ask, what was it that made you want to become a historian?
When I was a child, it was just a default that I would study history. I never questioned what I was going to study at university. I don't know where that came from, except that, like many children, I think I probably had things like R.J. Unsted's sort of very colourful books. I don't know. I was always just interested in the past and wanted to study it more. But I actually wanted to be a journalist for I thought that's what I'd go into for most of my sort of teenage years and at university. And I think there's good skills in journalism that are also make a good historian, like meeting deadlines and trusting or not trusting particular types of evidence. And I really kept those two interests in parallel as an undergraduate. And then I think I just realised when I graduated that I wasn't quite done with history. So maybe I would just do a master's and maybe I would just do a PhD. But I certainly wasn't sort of on a, sort of tenure mission or something to become an academic. I managed to sort of, I hope, combine the two. Obviously, my career has been in academia, but I've always been interested in being a sort of outward-faced historian and communicating the fruits of whatever I'm working on beyond just my colleagues and a very specialist audience. In terms of why the early modern period, I guess like many people, I also studied different periods at school. So I was in the first cohort of the GCSEs, which were very 20th century when they were introduced. Then I did a sort of 19th century course for A-level. Did a lot of 18th century as an undergraduate, partly because I was at Sydney Sussex College in Cambridge, where Tim Blanning is, Derek Beals. There was a sort of great constellation of 18th century expertise. But then, again, working backwards, in my final year, became very interested in the 17th century. I did a final year course called The British Problem that looked at the sort of interactions of England, Scotland and Ireland in the 16th and 17th centuries. And once I discovered the Civil Wars, probably like many people, I became incurably fascinated. So although I've gone back about as far as the mid-16th century, I've just published a book on James VI and First, who was born in 1566. I don't think I'll be moving from the long 17th century, as I like to think of it.
Like you mentioned, you've published quite a few books on this period. One's on Restoration Scotland, another's on Charles II, and most recently on his grandfather, James VI and First. And we're going to talk about all of them. But I want to start by asking about your 2021 book, Devil Land, England Under Siege, partly because it covers the whole period we're going to be discussing. So to begin with, as maybe a straightforward question, Devil Land, why did you call it that?
Always the kind of classic way I begin, because it's not going to make much sense to people if they don't get where the title's coming from. It's what an anonymous Dutch pamphleteer called England in 1652. And it was in reference to long-standing puns about the Angli, the English being angeli, angelic. This was a kind of jest from the medieval period. But to this Dutch pamphleteer's point of view, the English were anything but. They were fallen angels, diabolical devils. They had just put their divinely ordained and anointed King Charles I on trial publicly and executed him with the hand of the common executioner. They had installed a new republican regime that seemed unrepentant and defiant, and they were just about to declare war on the Dutch, not clearly as fellow Protestants, but as commercial rivals. So the point of this Dutchman in calling England Buifeland, Devil Land, was to say we need to wake up and see that the English are a very dangerous nation.
Do we have any idea who that author was, or could it be anyone?
I don't have any idea, but I think it captures a broader sense, so in a way perhaps it matters a little bit less who the author is, but a broader sense that we sometimes miss in the national history, the stories that we tell ourselves about England and Britain, but the degree, the extent of shock on the continent at Charles I's execution, the very public nature of it, and the fact. And again, I think this is often missed when we only look at the 17th century in isolation, particularly in France. The instant parallels and associations that were drawn with Elizabeth I's execution of Mary Queen of Scots, Charles I's grandmother. So to continental minds, the English are a very dangerous nation. They execute divinely ordained monarchs. In Mary Queen of Scots' case, at least it had been behind closed doors. But in Charles I's case, the very sort of public nature of the regicide and the idea that even if the crowds that all had assembled to watch events on the 30th of January 1649 couldn't really have done anything to stop it, somehow they are collectively implicated in this event. So there is widespread horror, really, at the very public nature of Charles I's trial and execution on the continent, shared by Protestants and by Republicans alike.
Something occurs to me, listening to your answer there. How does the horror at an orderly, as much as it can be, sentencing and execution of an anointed monarch, how does that differ to things like, the assassination of Henry IV of France?
Heads of state run a perennial risk of assassination. I think when Henri IV is assassinated in 1610, I think he'd survived something like 23 previous assassination attempts. But the lone wolf assassin is a danger that is recognised. It's deeply shocking to James VI and first in England, precisely because Henri is actually assassinated by a former monk, by a Catholic, who is outraged by Henri, who himself had converted from Protestantism, but who is prepared to work with James in continental geopolitics against the Catholic Habsburgs. But to James in 1610, this sums up the very real danger that the papacy posed to monarchs, temporal monarchs, whether they're Protestant or Catholic. If someone decides to act in the name of the papacy and attack somebody that they regard as either a heretic or a tyrant or both, that's a danger that all early modern monarchs run. I think that is very different, though. And this is somebody who steps aboard a movie. A coach, Henri IV's coach, gets stuck in traffic in Paris in 1610, and he is stabbed kind of through the window in a sort of frenzied attack. That's very different from, as you say, the formalities of a treason trial and a public execution.
What kind of sources do you draw on? You mentioned, obviously, the pamphleteer who lends the name of the book. Does that indicate an outside perspective on the events in England? Do you draw mostly on diplomatic papers and things like that?
The genesis of Devilland came directly from the 5 films that I made in sort of 2014, 2015 with BBC Two and BBC Scotland. The Stuarts was a series of 3 films about the Stuarts as rulers of a multiple monarchy between 1603 and 1707. And then that was followed by 2 films called The Stuarts in Exile about the Jacobite movement and challenges. And obviously that was filmed over, those films were made over the best part of 2 years, really. And we spent a lot of time on the continent, and the more time I spent in Madrid or Breda or parts of Italy or Paris thinking about the Stuarts, I just began to realise that they don't look instinctively English. How cosmopolitan they're a Scottish dynasty, so that makes sense. But also a dynasty that, from an external perspective, look very cosmopolitan, have lots of familial, dynastic, cultural, confessional links with continental dynasties. Each of the Stuarts, from James VI, Charles I, Charles II, James VII and II, marry at some point, not necessarily their first wife, but take on a Catholic consort at some point. And all of these spouses bring with them all sorts of dynastic and confessional entanglements. So the more time I spent on the continent, the more I thought that the Stuarts did not look like a dynasty that could necessarily be trusted to act in England's national interests. Actually quite a foreign dynasty with all of the old alliance and history that the Scottish Stuarts had brought with them. So I wanted to write Devilland, and it did really grow out of the television series that didn't adopt this perspective, but this was where the sort of seeds were sown to see how the Stuarts appeared externally. So it is, as you say, primarily diplomatic reports, but also a lot of printed literature, both published on the continent and back in Britain. And diplomats are kind of fascinating because they have a very double perspective. Obviously, they are narrating and sent to report on events in Britain, in London primarily, but they're always, in a double way, calibrating those events in terms of their own host nation. So the sorts of political events or cultural activities or religious difficulties that occur in 17th century Britain are very much refracted through the diplomat's own national perspectives. It does mean it's distorted. So I think one of the reviews of Devilland said it's a little bit like reading the sort of editorials in Le Monde or Corriere della Sera, or, foreign publications, because you're not going to necessarily see what you would regard as a totally sort of unmediated account of events in Britain. But in a way, I never sort of assumed it was. I don't think it's quite as distorted as, say, those anthologies of cartoons that come out every Christmas and you sort of retrace events where particular aspects are taken, they're distorted, they're exaggerated, they're caricatured. But I was interested, say, in that gap between what we think of as our national story from 1588 to 1688 and the ways in which it was perceived, particularly on the continent. But it's such a radical new departure for the English after Elizabeth I. I mean, I'm very struck by how little diplomatic representation Elizabeth promoted. She didn't have a diplomat in any Catholic state apart from France. Whereas James VI, who had been King of Scotland for 40 years, 20 years as an adult before he succeeded Elizabeth, part of his international campaign to defend his and uphold his right to succeed Elizabeth had been built on very, very careful diplomacy over many years with both Protestant and Catholic states. And Scotland is a much more small nation on the edge of continental Europe, whose presence at the international table was facilitated through very active diplomacy, both in receiving foreign ambassadors in Edinburgh and then sending them to continental cities. And that's exactly what James carries on in London. So this would have been very different, I think, for the English. I think James hosts something like over 250 foreign diplomatic missions in London in his 22-year reign as English king. So there is a massive amount of material. This is also material that has it remains obviously in foreign languages, but much of it was translated and calendared in the 19th century when that kind of diplomatic history was very popular, but has often remained in a slight silo of diplomatic history. I think what's often called the new diplomatic history now is a very recent phenomenon, really one to be welcomed in really trying to embed diplomatic history, having it interact and talk to other types of history rather than just be, the history of what one diplomat said to another. But what I was really trying to do was bring these sources into conversation with lots of other sort of standard sources, if you like, sort of standard newsletter or domestic newsletters or printed pamphlets of the type that we've been talking about.
And it leads to a much fuller picture. Maybe that's the hints of a possible journalistic career shining through.
Maybe. I think it's also a point of entry. I mean, I don't use the word literally, it's often misused, but it correctly used. Diplomats were literally the personification of their own monarchs. They had that plenipotentiary power, and often they appear very neurotic about things like orders of precedence or which position they're granted in a parade or which dinner they're invited to. Some of these can seem quite petty, but it's precisely because these can be perceived as slights on their own country that they're taken so seriously. But therefore, by the same logic, they are ambassadors and envoys, the only people that a monarch like James or like Charles II can converse with and feel that they are talking to somebody of a similar stature. So often they are much more unguarded in conversations with diplomats than they might be even with their own privy councillors, much to their own privy councillors' frustration.
At the moment in the main narrative of the podcast, we've just reached the Restoration. You've published a book on Restoration in Scotland. And so I wanted to talk a bit about that and how that was experienced north of the border, because so much stuff is very Anglo-centric. When the Stuarts return and there's the Restoration, there's not so much of a counter-revolutionary massacre that you might expect. Charles II is quite restrained with punishing people who had worked against him and his family. The regicides are, an exception. But the other exception, and this, something that seems to be quite a personal grudge almost, was the trial and execution of Archibald Campbell, the Marquis of Argyll. Was this a show of emotion from Charles? Was this a grudge that he wanted to pay back?
I think Charles is on the whole, remarkably non-vindictive. I think he is a pragmatist, and he realises that, returning to power with any form of narrowly conceived vindictive agenda is not going to create a broad coalition of stability and sort of actually keep him in power for very long. I think some of the difficulties, though, I mean, that's one thing for him and Hyde Clarendon to craft the Declaration of Breda in this very conciliatory terms. But, of course, there are lots of scores to be settled locally. And in Scotland, I'm sure you've covered this in the podcast, but broadly the whole nation had signed up to the covenant. at the outbreak of the civil wars back in the sort of 1630s in Scotland. But the progressive radicalization of different positions, the sort of fracturing within the kirk, had really sort of created deep fissures and also had generated divisions within the kirk between those who were prepared to reach some kind of pragmatic accommodation with the restored monarchy, and those who absolutely felt that this had to be, that the aims of the kirk had to be realized in any sort of restoration settlement. Yes, I think there is a degree to which some of the actions and some of the decisions that are taken are often almost sort of more royalist than the king. I think Charles initially envisages that in Scotland there will be a Presbyterian settlement of some type. The majority of the population seem to prefer Presbyterianism, and whether or not that means that bishops are restored in a very sort of reduced way. But actually, in the end, the initiative, and this happens in England too, with the quite narrow type of Anglican settlement that is eventually approved by Parliament, the people who are back in power are keen to settle some old scores. So in Scotland, Middleton and others around him come to power, and Argyll is the sort of sacrificial scapegoat at his trial.
You see it more as people like Middleton and Lauderdale and people like that who are in power in Edinburgh, who oversee his actual trial. They're more responsible for Argyll's fate than Charles, who had him arrested when he arrived at Whitehall.
Well, I think the fact that Charles has him arrested makes it clear that he's in, that he has him in his sights. And I mean, again, there have been so many different permutations of alliances formed and wars that have taken place in the sort of 1650s. And Argyll is not on the friendly side at this point as well. But yes, I mean, in terms of what goes on in Edinburgh, that trial is run by the Scottish elite at that point. I mean, Argyll has defence counsel, which is a privilege not granted to treason defendants in England. And the mood is captured. A very young advocate who later becomes Sir George Mackenzie of Roseau, who later becomes a Lord Advocate, who is tasked with defending Argyll, and says, much of the sorts of things that he did, any of us would have done. And actually, interestingly, at the beginning of the trial, he says, is it possible that whatever I say isn't myself? I can't later be accused of treason. And the court sort of says, no, you plead at your peril. Go on. So it's really quite a courageous set of pleadings that become, in the Argyll family history, quite iconic. There's a much later 18th century portrait of a Duke of Argyll in which he's holding Mackenzie's works and pointing to the pleading on behalf of his ancestor.
Oh, I had no idea that it would have such resonance down the generations of future Campbells.
Yes, I think it is a sort of moment. As you say, you have these, this is regime change. This is this very sort of transitional period. And the trial of Argyll is that moment in Scotland.
So when the restoration comes to Scotland, this restored elite perhaps come into power, what do they change and what do they keep?
They try to set the clock even further back than in England. The first action that the Restoration Scottish Parliament takes is to dismantle the citadels, the fortresses that the Cromwellian state had erected in places like Leith. So that's quite a decisive rejection of any putative union with England, and the implication is that this was a military occupation. And another key piece of legislation is the Act Tressisserie in 1661 that essentially turns the legislative clock back to 1633. And that ignores, interestingly, meetings of the Scottish Parliament at which even Charles I himself had been present in 1640. All of that is kind of wiped out. So it is as though not only the Cromwellian era, but also the civil wars, and actually most of the 1630s had ever happened. They go back to what's called the Coronation Parliament in 1633, when Charles, slightly belatedly, 8 years after he'd acceded to the crown, but goes to Scotland to be crowned. Try to turn the clock back to that. It's not uncontentious. The legislation that's passed in 1662 is a much more narrowly Episcopalian structure that is recreated. There's none of the wealth or traditional infrastructure, if you like, to support that church. That Episcopalian church is a very weak church, and that is one of the difficulties of the Restoration. This was research I did decades ago for my PhD, but the difficulties of that church, many of whose members themselves are quite Irenic, people like Robert Leighton, really regard the main threat to religion as not it shouldn't be divisions between Episcopalians and Presbyterians. It should be joining forces against Catholicism. It should be taking on the growing threat of forms of non-religion or deism, or even in extreme cases, sort of atheism. So there's a lot of distress about the main divisions erupting over things like ceremonial dress or rights of sort of patronage of bishops and that dimension.
As you mentioned before, the Covenant, the National Covenant, and then the Solemn League and Covenant were taken up en masse by large swathes of the Scottish population. What happened to all of them when the Restoration came in?
Well, I think it's worth, again, sometimes going back and rereading the various texts. I mean, the National Covenant, as it became known, that was formulated in the late 1630s, is couched in very sensibly loyalist language. We the people of Scotland, sort of summarising and paraphrasing wildly, uphold our loyalty to the Stuart monarchy. We the people of Scotland defend our right to uphold religion as framed in 1581, with a very sort of careful avoidance of saying what will happen if those two undertakings come into conflict with one another. So that explains why so many people who were very worried at the direction that Charles I seemed to be taking the Church of Scotland in the 1630s, why so many people could sign it. When that then became the banner under which people took up arms to fight against representatives of Charles I, that was clearly a much greater step and not one that was shared by all of those who had signed it. So people like Lauderdale had signed the covenant, but become one of the Charles II's sort of great enforcers in Restoration Scotland. One of the difficulties too, in thinking about sort of church policy in Scotland and Charles and how much Charles II was invested in it, was that his own experiences in Scotland in 1650 and 1651 had been pretty miserable. It was at a time when he was very weak. He was hoping that Scotland would offer him a royalist army that he could then use to invade England. But instead of which, he found himself on the sharp end of Kirk censure a lot of the time. His coronation in Scone on the 1st of January 1651 is essentially a sort of a lecturing about how weak monarchs are. And these cartoons of his nose being held to the grindstone by the Presbyterian Kirk. He spends a lot of time hearing about the sins of his ancestors. This is not the kind of state church over which he wishes to preside, and certainly not the kind of state church over which he presides in Restoration England. So he is very determined, once he's back in England, that he will never go to Scotland again. I mean, he has very, very negative memories of his time there. So I think that probably also has to be borne in mind too. He's more than happy to give John Maitland, later kind of Duke of Lauderdale, a free hand.
Now, that leads quite neatly into my next group of questions about your book on Charles II. Sticking with what's apparently a theme of my question, you called it Charles II, the Star King. Now, I'm curious, why did you pick this sobriquet instead of his more common one, the Merry Monarch?
So this was part of the Penguin Monarch series, which is kind of wonderfully democratic conceit that every monarch, no matter how long the reign or how significant, would each get 25,000 words. I think it evolved from an idea that this is something you could read, say, in several hours, that if you were on a plane from London to New York and you picked up this at Heathrow, on any monarch with Athelstan or Edward VIII or whatever, you perhaps might know nothing about them, but by the time you landed, you would have a decent insight into them. So it was a challenge. Everybody was given the same number of words. And mine, I decided not to do a kind of cradle to grave chronological approach. There's a tight narrative, but then it becomes very thematic. The title itself is a play on Charles's image and how you might compare or contrast him to Louis XIV, that we think of as the Sun King. So then I sort of pick it apart in the book. But there are good reasons for the Star King. It was always said on 29th of May 1630 that a bright daytime star had shone in the skies above London. And then later, when he then went on 11, so long years of exile during the 11 years of the Protectorate, but actually he'd been in exile for longer than that, since the mid-1640s. All those years of impoverished, itinerant, the poverty, really. When he then came back into London in 1660, those tropes about daytime star, that this had been like the star that had led the wise men to Christ at the time of the Nativity, that this had been a sort of sign of his greatness. There's also, and I play with this idea a bit, there is an element of star quality about Charles. Very few people embody their monarch in their era in quite the same way. You think about, as you say, the Merry Monarchs, you think about ringlets and this kind of Baroque theatricality. And Charles was very, very adept at, as he often put it, playing the king. I mean, he would lend his coronation robes to the actor Betterton to use on the stage. I mean, that's kind of the degree to which Charles was prepared to regard being king as a role that he played. And he would often sometimes pit Charles Stuart, the person, against Charles II, the king, and think, what would either of those do? And then usually, as observers said, he'd usually do whatever Charles Stuart himself preferred to do rather than Charles II, the monarch. Yeah, he played quite a lot with those ideas of stars. And also, I mean, Charles himself designed this massive sort of gilt star that he wanted to put onto the side of Windsor Castle, that it would sort of reflect this sort of shimmering Thames underneath. And the one sign of royalty that he had the whole way through his exile was his Garter star, from being created in the Knight of the Garter in the late 1630s. He wore that star very prominently. So when his crown and everything had been melted down, he was at least left with this star.
The Windsor Castle star, did that actually pan out?
I think there were designs for it. I'm not sure it was ever kind of executed. Charles had lots of ideas for, and bits of Windsor were designed. He also had a great sort of plan to, when he got very fed up with London towards the end of his reign, to create this huge new palace in Winchester, and had amazing designs for it. So, actually, again, that would have been much more like Versailles in its sort of organisation. And I do talk about that kind of star quality. I mean, charisma is, in the 17th century, a quality that is not very positively regarded. I mean, your capacity to be able to charm someone is dangerous if you might sort of, make them do things they don't want to do. But a lot of people talk about Charles having what we would now say in a very positive way about charisma, the capacity to charm people on a very personal level.
That will lead into my next question, which is, what was his... Obviously, he reigned for a substantial amount of time after his restoration, but what was his relationship like with his parliament?
Charles, I think, and actually the same goes for James VI and I mean, both of them lend themselves to caricature and subsequent historiography. But both of them are very pragmatic. And Charles, we tend to think, has left nothing like the writings of, say, his grandfather, James VI and or the icon basilica of his father. He himself says, he's not a writer. He always sort of starts off family letters with, I'm so sorry, I don't really like writing. I don't have time, and it's a scrawl. He is also, there is much more than we think there is in terms of his speeches and other statements. And he's very clear with Parliament at his restoration that Crown finance has been a problem for the Stuarts, and he has a clear idea, really, of what it costs if Parliament want him to be able to do the sorts of things that they may wish him to do. But that never gets resolved. And James VI and had, really argued with his parliaments and always said, if you want me to lead great wars on the continent, you're going to have to pay for it. And that never happened. The real overhaul of Crown finance doesn't happen until the 1690s under William of Orange, with the creation of the Bank of England and the idea of a national debt. But all the Stuart monarchs really struggle with that they depend on Parliament for money, but then Parliament uses that as leverage to try and either withhold legislation they don't like or push legislation that monarchs don't like. So his relationship is not great. Despite a triennial act being in force, he doesn't call fresh elections. In the 1660s, there are instances, and I talk about them in the book, where he clearly lies to Parliament about his intentions against the French. Much is often made in the historiography about him receiving secret subsidies from the French, which he does, but they're still relatively small compared to the kinds of sums that later in the 18th century are accorded to the monarch.
And so we touched on it a little bit there, but Charles has obviously had quite an eventful first 30 years of his life, to say the least. Can we see this influence his rule? Like, can we talk about things? I know it's hard to diagnose people from 300 years ago, but can we see trends of, I don't know, trauma? Or I know he loves his story about escaping from Worcester, but that must have been quite a terrifying experience on its own. Never mind, exile and poverty, like we discussed.
Yes, I'm not sure that trauma is so readily identifiable, but the capacity to dissimulate, the capacity to lie in another version. I think the shrewdness and the pragmatism. I mean, if you think about those years in exile, Charles has to play a very difficult role. I mean, he has to remain sufficiently convincing that he becomes the default when everything else fails, that he has to maintain enough of a semblance of being the head of a major European house, and at the same time not fall prey to every time the sealed not want him to come over, and he would just have walked straight into arrest and presumably execution. So he has to play this sort of clever game of keeping enough domestic royalist hopes going at a time when they often look very bleak under Cromwell, and at the same time also sort of preserving himself. And he's rather unceremoniously asked to leave France once the French decide that actually their best options foreign policy-wise are to form an alliance with the Cromwellian state. And he becomes very itinerant. He sort of moves around. Lots of pressure is put on him by Catholic heads of state to convert to Catholicism and the Spanish, and then they'll give him an army. And again, Charles has to resist and say, no, if I'm going to go back and stay on the throne, it will have to be, because that's what my own people want me to be, and converting to Catholicism is not going to help that. So I think that capacity, I think that recognition that he's only on his throne for as long as his people want him to be, and that this is precarious and that it's conditional, I think that never leaves him. You talked about his being sort of, I think, both haunted and inspired simultaneously by his experiences after the Battle of Worcester, when he spends 43 days on the run, essentially in disguise, hiding from his own people. And this is unprecedented, really, for any monarch, especially one who is as tall and physically distinctive as him. I mean, it's really a tribute to often Catholic families, who had become very skilled at hiding priests and conducting their activities sort of very covertly. I mean, it was a number of Catholic families that sheltered Charles in those very dramatic days in 1651. And I think the fact that Charles reverts to it so often, there's a huge series of paintings that are commissioned in the 1660s, probably as some form of domestic interior decoration, sort of with scenes from those 41 days on the run. I mean, this is a monarch having to go amongst his own subjects incognito. And again, going back to those folk hero ideas of sort of inversion, I think that appeals to Charles, and he likes telling these stories. And there's a lot made of his Oak Apple Day, is celebrated the day that he famously spent hiding in an oak tree after the Battle of Worcester. It's why the Royal Oak is still one of the most common pub names in England. And he decides, I think there's an interesting shift that happens with Charles around the time of what we call the Exclusion Crisis after the Popish Plot in the late 1670s, 1680s. I mean, interestingly, it's not until then that Charles decides he wants actually to commit his own version of what happened in those years to paper, and he chooses a very good person to tell it to, Samuel Pepys, who goes up to Newmarket, and he tells Pepys, asks, I want you to sort of write all this down. And it's also those years when, I think Charles had tried to be non-partisan, tried to be pragmatic for 2 decades, but that is when he totally shifts after the Popish Plot and the Exclusion Crisis, in favour of the Tories, decides he will, after the Oxford Parliament that he dissolves very quickly, that he will, in 1681, that he will never call another Parliament again. And then there is this vindictive Tory reaction, and Charles has sort of essentially won that standoff with Parliament and the Exclusion Parliaments, by depicting the Whigs and his opponents, the ones who were trying to get his younger brother excluded. That's why it's called the Exclusion Crisis. Younger brother James, Duke of York, who was a Catholic, trying to get him excluded from the line of succession. And Charles, whatever reservations he had about his brother, absolutely will not let that happen. He doesn't think it's up to Parliament, and actually he doesn't think it's up to him to decide who is the next monarch. God might be moving in a very mysterious way that he hasn't granted Charles legitimate progeny. He's got at least 14 illegitimate children. So, this might be all very mysterious, that God seems to think that the right person to succeed him is his brother, and Charles has reservations about his brother's suitability for the throne, but it is not for Parliament, and it is not for him to change the line of succession. Charles himself has waited many years to gain his rightful throne, and I think for him this is a red line that he then comes down very firmly against the exclusionists and embarks on what's often called his personal rule from 1681 for the last 4 years of his life.
The podcast will probably spend quite some time with Charles II. So what should listeners and myself keep in mind about Charles as we cover his reign?
Personally, the first 30 years, one of my frustrations with depictions of James VI and I in English historiography is that it often just starts in 1603, as though this isn't somebody with decades of experience. And I think it's tempting to sort of think of the Restoration as sort of just starting, well, it does in 1660. But the individual at the centre of it all is someone who has honed their sort of political skills in very difficult, trying circumstances on the continent, where very different styles of kingship again obtain, and that cosmopolitanism and that readiness to perceive English politics through a continental frame of reference, essentially what Devilland's about as well. But I think that is important in Charles II's day. And again, that this is an attempt to resurrect and rehabilitate the triple monarchy after the dislocation of the civil wars, and that Charles is a king of three kingdoms, all of which have very different religious preferences among their peoples. I mean, on the face of it, they all have an established Protestant church, Church of England, Church of Scotland, Church of Ireland. But certainly in Ireland, it's a very minority taste that only probably attracts about 10% of the population. There's then very strong ties to Presbyterianism in Scotland, particularly in the north of Ireland, but then also obviously a majority Catholic population. And then in Scotland, the edifice of a Protestant Episcopalian church, national church, but a predominantly Presbyterian population and an increasingly radicalized minority among those Presbyterians who are willing to take up arms if need be against the state. And then Episcopalian church in England, but again, strong non-conformist challenges to that. And the sheer difficulty of that inheritance. When we think about multiple monarchies, you might think about sort of the Habsburgs, but all of the territories, the Spanish Habsburgs, all of the territories over which they rule are Catholic. I think the Stuarts do have a uniquely challenging confessional and religious and ecclesiastical hand to deal with.
That three kingdoms approach. Loads of historians have probably pointed out, but there's one in particular who points out that the Whigs and the Tories are both, their origins are from those other two kingdoms, and yet they become associated with English politics.
Yeah, but that's abuse. I mean, the Whigamores were Scots Presbyterians and the Tories were Irish outlaws. So yeah, it is quite telling that they become the nicknames for the two-party system that emerges. Again, when I was talking about that period of the exclusion crisis being very important in Charles's reign, I mean, that is also the period in which our modern two-party system emerges.
To enter the third section of the interview, I want to talk about your most recent book, and it is very recent, The Mirror of Great Britain, which is a biography of James VI and I, which came out just a few weeks ago as of recording. It's obviously 400 years on from his death in 1625. So we'll keep with the theme. Why did you pick why the Mirror of Great Britain? Why did you choose that title?
So it refers specifically to a portrait that was painted of James, full-length portrait by De Critz about 1604, so shortly after his accession to the English throne, in which he's depicted wearing this very prominent hat jewel that is known as the Mirror of Great Britain. It's made up of diamonds and rubies in both the Scottish and English royal collections, and it gives you sort of spangling, symbolic realization of James's unionist vision. I mean, James assumed on succeeding Elizabeth I that it would be a natural progression to create a new state of Great Britain from his formerly warring kingdoms of Scotland and England. So at one level, it is a reference to that hat jewel, and there's obviously a picture of that portrait in the book. But then, a little bit like the Star King, although probably in more depth, I then do riff on mirrors a lot because they give James one of his favourite literary metaphors. So James, in every opening speech to the English Parliament, he offers them, from 1683 onwards, he offers them a very rare and fine present, a crystal mirror, which he says is a way of showing his inner thoughts. And he talks extensively about people's lives being mirrors, usually as a means of inculcating exemplarity, but also you should look in the mirror to see the things that displease you as well. And as he says to MPs and peers, there are various ways in which you can harm mirrors. You can guard them in a false light and misinterpret words. You can cast foul breath over them and, again, turn people's words to ill intention. Or, very worst of all, you can drop a mirror and shatter it, therefore sort of disregard royal authority. So it is a metaphor that he uses constantly in lots of different ways. I mean, it's a very common metaphor. There's the speculum principii genre. There's about 400 works published between 1400 and 1700 in England that have mirror, usually a sort of mirror for princes or a looking glass or a glass somewhere in their title. So it's absolutely not unique to James, but it is interesting, both in his private correspondence and in his formal speeches, how often he comes back to the ideas of a mirror. And then also there's these sort of classic mirroring moments on the stage. And you think about that moment when a mirror is held up in Macbeth, and it's a thought that James was probably in the first audience to see William Shakespeare's Macbeth performed, and Banquo sort of sees this endless reflection of Stuart monarchs thereafter. So there are lots of just interesting mirror moments in James's reign.
Because it's your most recent book, and I haven't really talked about the historiography of your others, I want to ask about that now. So where does the Mirror of Great Britain, where does that fit within the historiography, and what was it that you wanted to say with this book?
I didn't necessarily mean to write another book so quickly after Devilland. I really, but one thing that had struck me when Devilland was published was a lot of people volunteered that one of the things that had really struck them about it was that it had changed their view of James. And I was slightly shocked by the number of people who instantly just said something that came out of sort of 1066 and all that. James slobbered at the mouth and had favourites. He was thus a bad king. And, that was first published in 1930. But in the same year, actually, The Devilland was published, and I quote this in the introduction to the James book. There's a Spectator book review that basically just says the same thing. This is this slobbering king, sort of shits in his saddle while he's hunting and is a bit of a disaster. And, and then, there's, and the sorts of things that people know about James, really are either about sex and gay lovers or witches. And some of that was clear in the TV adaptation, sort of Mary and George recently. So it was a little bit against this background of, I suppose, me being surprised that caricatured stereotype was still so pervasive. But the other bit was, so one of it was also, to be completely honest, the anniversary. I realised that 2025 was 400 years, and anniversaries really mattered to James. I mean, on one level, we can all think that they're just arbitrary. It's just another day, and it doesn't really have any impact on events 400 years before. But James himself was very keen on anniversaries, and in Scotland, we were talking right at the beginning about the dangers that monarchs faced, and James always claimed that he'd been the subject of an assassination attempt in something called the Gowrie Conspiracy in August 1600 when he was King of Scotland. And the Kirk didn't like non-religious festivals, but James insisted on having the Gowrie Conspiracy, its anniversary, celebrated every year by the Kirk as a sort of day of Thanksgiving. Then when he came to England, he made his accession day, an annual calendar. And then there's one that we still celebrate today, discovery of the gunpowder plot on the 5th of November, 1605. So he made that an annual day for celebration and commemoration and reflection. As James recognised, anniversaries do give you this opportunity to reconsider and to sort of rethink somebody. And what I wanted to do in this book was look at James in his entirety as both King of Scotland and King of England. It is true that historians in Scotland are very interested in James in the late 16th century, but their interest tends to wane once he moves from Scotland to England in 1603. So Stephen Reed has published the first of an excellent, what looks like it will be an excellent 2-volume biography of James. The first volume came out in 2023, which looks at James's life from his birth in 1566 to the mid-1580s. Second volume, I'm not sure when it will be published, will be appear from the mid-1580s to 1603, but it will end in 1603. Alex Courtney, another fine scholar, has published the first volume of a biography of James last year that looks at his Scottish kingship, 1566 to 1603, and then I think several years down the line he intends to publish the second volume that sort of goes from 1603 to 1625. But apart from the fact that I don't know that readers always want to read multi-volume histories of monarchs, what I wanted to do was actually just put those Jameses together. So there's lots of interest in James, say, as often seen as a persecutor of witches. He presides over several notorious witchcraft trials in Scotland in the early 1590s. But less people know that he remained very interested in witchcraft as King of England and would interrogate suspected witches himself, would also sponsor prosecutions in Star Chamber of people accused of vexatious allegations of witchcraft. I just wanted to put those two things together. And the same with Parliament, his handling and dealings with the Scottish Parliament, how do those differ and contrast with his experiences in England? So it's not a cradle to grave biography. There is a broad chronological arc, but it is then very thematic. So there are lots of chapters on things like crown finance, religion. But I think the other big thing I wanted to do was put James's words at the centre of it. So he is this amazing wordsmith. His use of print, the different genres in which he publishes, from From a very early age, from 18, his first publication in Scotland is a manual of poetic style. He's very interested in poetry. He publishes works of political theory, Bacillip and Doron, The True Law of Free Monarchies, and those sort of cement his reputation as one of the foremost proponents of the divine right of kings in Europe. He publishes demonology. He's the only early modern monarch to publish a book about witchcraft and demonology. His first publication when he comes to England is a counterblast against tobacco, a sort of large anti-smoking tract. He then publishes a series of works against papal rights of rebellion in the wake of the Gunpowder Plot, and he writes numerous proclamations. Eventually, he oversees the folio edition of his collected works in early 1617. I mean, no monarch had ever sort of brought together their works in this way, but it's about the same time that Ben Jonson collects his stage plays and collected folio works. So both of these are a kind of precedent for Shakespeare's collected works in 1623. And he also oversees the King James Bible, this team of amazing sort of philological achievement, teams of scholars that produce what's often seen as the authorized, the King James version that's published in 1611. And I wanted James's interest in language, the number of times he's cited in the Oxford English Dictionary for neologisms. I wanted that at the heart of it as well. So, so that's the book. There's chapters on his obsession with hunting and his interest in animals. There's chapters about his sartorial image, the way he's depicted in portraits, and his physical health. There's chapters about Ireland. There's chapters about his interest in being Solomon and a lawgiver. He presides in legal cases much more than any previous monarch. There's also chapters on his royal sort of loves, his numerous emotional entanglements, often with much younger men, as well as his family life with Queen Anna and Princes Henry and Charles and Princess Elizabeth. Those were the aims of the book.
It sounds like an incredible book. Final question. But what is one thing, just one thing, that you wish more people knew about this period? The whole period from 1588 to 1688.
That we've been in very unstable, uncertain geopolitical times before, and I was quite taken aback when I submitted the manuscript and my editor read it, and he said, "Oh, this is such a comfort read." And that wasn't how I'd envisaged it, but at the time, I then very quickly saw what he meant. I mean, we have a tendency to think that, we live in very unstable times geopolitically. But you need to go back to the 17th century to see that we have been here before, and that precarity and vulnerability and volatility are leitmotifs of the 17th century. And although we tell ourselves very comfortable stories about the rise of democracy or the rise of religious toleration or the rise of parliament, those can be quite deceptive.
That was a remarkably upbeat and optimistic answer to that. Thank you very much for that. That's cheered me up immensely.
No problem.
So with that, Professor Clare Jackson, thank you so much for speaking with me today. This has been amazing, and I highly recommend that listeners get a copy of all of your books, but particularly your most recent one, The Mirror of Great Britain. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for having me.